Four young men on a barge on the river Thames. What could they be talking about? Something dramatic or something about drama? Let's read together this famous essay by John Dryden, where he presents a dramatic conversation between four friends, Eugenius, Crites, Lycidas, and Neander. They speak not just on the dramatic conventions of their times, but also engage in a broader exploration of aesthetics, morality, and the evolving nature of drama itself. So stay with me till the end of this video as I take you through the most important parts of Dryden's John Dryden was a very influential poet, playwright, and literary critic. In fact, he is considered to be one of the leading figures of the Restoration period. Although Dryden is primarily known for his wit and satire, especially for his verse satires such as Absalom and Achitophel, Macflecknoe, he also wrote tragedies such as All for Love. So he was a man of multiple talents. And when it comes to literary criticism, this essay happens to be one of the most important works that we have from the Restoration period. What is interesting about this essay is that the format of this essay is like a drama, or rather a scene in a drama. Four friends are on this barge on the river Thames. And why are they there? There is a naval battle going on between England and Holland. That is between English and the Dutch. So there's a lot of cannon fire and all. And within this backdrop, where you have this idea of national pride going on, we have four learned gentlemen who gather to discuss literature, more specifically drama. So this is like the setting we have for the debate. So what you have to understand in this essay is the different kinds of points of view that we have from these different characters, and each of them act as the spokesperson of either a type of drama or a theory of drama. So we have to identify which character is speaking in favor of what or whom. Now, as we go through the essay, we'll be looking at some important lines which will help us understand who is speaking in favor of what kind of drama. So, how does the debate begin? First, we have a description of the characters, where the description of Crites is very interesting and it shows Dryden's humor. Crites, a person of a sharp judgment and somewhat too delicate a taste in wit. So, Crites is a person who is witty, but at the same time, he has a sharp judgment. So, he becomes sarcastic at times, for which people often misunderstand him as rude. So, this is the way he describes Crites. So, we have an image in our mind of a sarcastic person here, which the world have mistaken in him for ill nature. So, he first proposes that if the concernment of this battle, so he is referring to the battle between the English and the Dutch, if the concernment of this battle had not been so exceeding great, he could scarce have wished the victory. Now, the point is, whenever there is a war and any country wins, then usually the poets glorify that attempt or glorify that victory. It's a very natural outcome. Now, what Crites is saying, he's saying that the poets all around us, they write such horrible kind of poems that he really regrets that England has won, because that has led to these kinds of poems to be written, which he doesn't regard as good poetry at all. Okay. So he says that if he had less of a spirit of nationalism, he would have regretted the victory even. And then Lycidas says that yes, you are right. There are some poets who do not know how to write poetry, but there are good ones too. So he says there are some of those impertinent people you speak of who, to my knowledge, are already so provided, either way, that they can produce not only a panegyric upon the victory, but if need be, a funeral elegy upon the duke. And after they have crowned his valor with many laurels, at last deplore the odds under which he fell, concluding that his courage deserved a better destiny. So, Lycidas, we can see, is giving a fitting reply to Crates, saying that you're very correct. There are people who overdo these kinds of things, and they write poems on specifically on nationalism, national pride, and focusing on any duke or any kind of nobleman. So he is criticizing that kind of an attitude as well. So how do they end up talking about drama when they started with poetry? It was Eugenius who says that it is not true that all poets are bad poets. And he says, you pursue your point too far, you're taking it too far. As to my own particular, I am so great a lover of poesy that I could wish them all rewarded who attempt but to do well. So he is saying that we cannot downright disregard every kind of poem that is written because there are meritorious ones. And this goes on, and we realize through this conversation that Crates is essentially a very bitter person who feels that the literary output in the name of poetry, whatever is going on around them, is not at all excusable. And he does not like them simply. So obviously Crates is not approving of the conventions that are used in his contemporary times or by his contemporary poets. That means he is an advocate of the ancients. And this is how the debate begins. But before that, there is a kind of an agreement where they decide upon what kind of poetry or what kind of literature are they going to talk about. It is Eugenius who first proposes that they should have a systematic debate. And he says, I would ask Crates to what part of poesy he would confine his arguments. So he wants Crates to speak on poesy. Poesy means in general poetry. And you should remember that back in the Elizabethan times at least, and to some extent during the Reformation also, although during the Reformation we do not have much drama, but usually we see the use of blank verse in drama. So poetry and drama, they were not distinguishable. Even in case of Aristotle's Poetics, we see that the name of the book is Poetics, but he's talking about drama. So these are interchangeable terms. So now they want to narrow down to any particular type of poesy. And Eugenius says whether he would defend the general cause of the ancients against moderns, because Crates is supporting the ancients. Ancients means the Greek, Latin, classical writers. So Crates is the spokesperson for the ancient poets or dramatists. And in reply to Eugenius, Crates says that he would limit their dispute to dramatic poesy, in which he thought it not difficult to prove that the ancients were superior. So Crates was the one who fixed on this topic or finalized this topic that we are going to talk about, dramatic poetry, that is drama. Now, Eugenius looks surprised. Why? Because Eugenius himself believes that in case of other kinds of poetry, the Greeks and Latin poets, they might be called superior, but in case of drama, he believes that his contemporary writers or the moderns, according to them, they have evolved in a better way. So he thinks that Crates would lose in any case if they are talking about dramatic poesy and make a comparison between the ancients and the moderns. So what we gather is that Eugenius is kind of defending the moderns, and we have Crates defending or speaking in favor of the ancients. Now, before they begin their formal debate, Lycidas wants to pinpoint or define a play, or rather he wants to say that if we don't define dramatic poetry, or if we don't define drama, then we cannot compare, right? So he proposes a definition. Lycidas told him it was necessary before they proceeded further to take a standing measure of their controversy. Because how, like he says, for how was it possible to be decided who read the best plays before we know what a play should be? So here we see that what Dryden is attempting to do is he is attempting to define drama, but he does not want to make it look like it is his own definition. So he brings in these four characters to provide a more rounded definition, like where something to which all four of them agree. So what definition comes out of their agreement? Let's look at that. Lycidas was given the responsibility to define drama, and he says, a play ought to be a just and lively image of human nature. Now, if you are familiar with Aristotle's Poetics, you will identify a similarity. Aristotle also begins his definition of drama by using the word imitation of an action. So, this idea that a play is a lively image of human nature is very much similar to Aristotle's idea that play is an imitation of an action that is serious, representing its passions and humors and the changes of fortune. This changes of fortune means in a play, it doesn't go like this, that the hero stays on the same level throughout. His life changes. So drama presents a kind of a change of fortune. And in case of Poetics, we had this technical term called peripety or reversal. And after reversal comes the anagnorisis or realization. So instead of using these Aristotelian terms, we are rather getting a very similar kind of an idea where Lycidas is defining a play as a kind of an image or a replica or a reflection or rather an imitation of human nature where there is a change of fortune to which it is subject for the delight and instruction of mankind. Now, this is something which we do not have in Aristotle. In Aristotle, yes, we do have the idea of catharsis, which is kind of, you can equate it with delight, if not directly delight, but a kind of a calmness that is achieved by the audience through the purgation of pity and terror and all those things. Here, Lycidas manipulates the definition of Aristotle to put in the two ideas of delight and instruction. Now, why this idea is important? The point is instruction. That is, through drama, something will be taught to the audience. This concept is very, very British, because in the history of British drama, we see that drama started in England through morality plays and mystery plays and miracle plays, which were completely governed by the church or which had moral themes, where drama was seen as an instrument of instruction. Therefore, Lycidas' definition is an amalgamation of both Aristotle and the British concept of drama as a vehicle of instruction and delight. All right? Now, Crates raised objection. This definition, though Crates raised a logical objection against it, that it was only a genre et fine, that is, too broadly. So it's a too broad genre. You can have so many different kinds of plays that were written that it was difficult for somebody to compare that which kind of play was better than the other or which style was better than the other. So Crates wanted to pin down even further. Maybe he was thinking about tragedy as a type of dramatic art. But here we see that no, they are making it even broad. Anyway, Crates begins talking in favor of the ancients. And what does he actually say? Let's get down to the most important thing that he says. Those ancients, this is what Crates is saying, those ancients have been faithful imitators and wise observers of what? Of that nature, which is so torn and ill represented in our plays. So he says that in the plays that were produced during their times, which is past for us, like Critias, Leander, they also lived in what we look at as our past. But for them, it was the modern time. So when they use the word modern, don't get confused. Don't think that they're talking about 20th century. They are talking about their times. For them, that was the modern period. Okay, because like for us, this is the modern period, right? That. So modern as opposed to ancients. Critias is saying that the ancients could imitate properly nature, whereas in their contemporary playwrights, they were seeing that nature or human nature was not properly imitated. That means things were shown on stage which do not actually happen in real life. They have handed down to us a perfect resemblance of her. Her means nature. So the legacy which we had received from the ancients, that is a perfect. But what we have done with it, that is what Critias is saying, which we, like ill copiers, so we are very bad photocopy machines, and what we have done, we have neglecting to look on, have rendered monstrous and disfigured. But that you may know how much you are indebted to those your masters, and be ashamed to have so ill requited them. So he is calling the ancients the masters, and he is regretting the idea that whatever knowledge was passed down from the ancients regarding writing of a play, that was misutilized and disfigured in the hands of his contemporary writers. And what is the result? I must remember you that all the rules by which we practice the drama, either such as relate to the justness and symmetry of the plot, episodical ornaments, description, narration, other beauties, which are not essential to the play, were delivered to us from the observations that Aristotle made. So he wants to emphasize the debt or the legacy of Aristotelian observations, and he says that Aristotle had made certain observations on poets or playwrights, and those observations were handed down to us, and we are trying to follow them. We have added nothing of our own, except we have the confidence to say our wit is better. Now we all know that the Restoration age is known as the age of wit and reason, or prose and reason, because of so many different kinds of genres emerging. Like we have satire in novel, we have verse satire, and even in prose we have satirical writings. Think about those periodical press outputs. So he is saying that our age has only added wit and has done nothing else to contribute to the evolution of drama. And then he says that out of that book of Aristotle, we have extracted certain rules. First, he talks about the three unities. And he says, out of these two has been extracted the famous rules which the French call des trois unités, or the three unities which ought to be observed in every regular play, namely of time, place, and action. So it is the job of the French playwrights to decide that Aristotle had talked about three unities. Okay? And then Critias goes on to elaborate the three unities. And what does he say? He says that the unity of time suggests that the events in a play should ideally unfold within a 24-hour period, just to avoid an unrealistic stretch of time. And then when he talks about unity of place, he says that the entire play should take place in a single location or within a limited area, again, to be in tune with the audience's idea of the stage as a limited space. And finally, the unity of action, which requires that a play's focus or the plot's focus is on one main event or action. How did the Greeks follow it? Critias continues to explain. This rule of time, how well it has been observed by the ancients, most of their plays will witness. You see them in their tragedies from the very beginning of their plays falling close into that part of the story which they intend for the action or principal object of it, leaving the former part to be delivered by narration. That means whatever is the focus of the play is acted out, and whatever happens before that, if it is something that has happened long back, then that is presented not as a dramatic way, but as a narration in order to preserve the unity of time. And for the unity of place, Critias says the ancients meant by it that the scene ought to be continued through the play. So Critias is trying to say that the Greeks followed the unity of place, time and action. And then he judges the modern plays according to these unities and says, if by these rules to omit many other drawn from the precepts and practice of the ancients. So if he is focusing only on these rules of the unities, we should judge our modern plays. It is probable that few of them would endure the trial, that in the plays that are written during their times, these unities are not adhered to, or these unities are not maintained, and therefore these are inferior plays, and the ancients who stuck to those unities were superior. This is Critias' argument. And he talks in a very humorous manner, and we understand why he is considered to be sarcastic most of the time. Then he says, it's very witty also. He says, that which should be the business of a day, that is unity of time, takes up in some of them an age. Instead of one action, they are epitomes of a man's life. So it's not unity of action at all. And for one spot of ground, that is unity of place, which the stage should represent, we are sometimes in more countries than the map can show us. So this is how he humorously tries to tell that the moderns have completely gone against the concept of the unities, and therefore they have failed to write good plays. Critias stops and Eugenius replies. How does he reply? He says that I have observed in your speech that the former part of it is convincing as to what the moderns have profited by the rules of the ancients. Yes, in your speech you have told that the ancients have passed down certain rules which have benefited us, because we now know what a drama looks like and we try to do that. But in the letter, that is the later part of your speech, you are careful to conceal. That means you have hidden, you have not explained how much they have excelled them. That is, Critias has deliberately chose to not talk about the things in which the modern writers have excelled, the things that they have actually added. So in a way we understand that Eugenius on one hand is trying to establish a balance, and on the other hand he is giving a counterpoint to Critias' claims. And what does he say? It shall now be my task to show you some part of their defects. There means ancients. So he wants to point out to Critias that your Greek and Latin writers were not gods and demigods. They also had defects and some few excellencies of the moderns. So we clearly understand that his point is completely contrary to Critias. How does he begin? Be pleased then in the first place to take notice that the Greek poesy, which Critias has affirmed to have arrived to perfection in the reign of the Old Comedy, was so far from it that the distinction of it into acts was not known to them. Now, the first point that Eugenius makes is that the Greeks did not know how to break their plays into acts. So this is something that the modern writers are doing, which means they are looking at their plays in a more systematic way, and we have act divisions. And that is right, because in earlier times, the plays were not divided into acts. Rather, the chorus came in, and whenever the chorus came in, it felt as if this was the break which two acts have in between. So that is how it was done during the time of the Greeks. And Eugenius says that, see, they didn't even know how to break their plays into acts. All we know of it is from the singing of their chorus So the song of the chorus, which came in at regular intervals, that divided the play up. So it was not technically divided into acts. And that too is so uncertain that in some of their plays, we have reason to conjecture they sung more than 5 times. Now, if the chorus is singing for 5 times, it means there are 5 acts. But sometimes they sang more than 5 times. So does it mean there is more than 5 acts? What comes out of this argument is that the idea that there should be 5 acts in a play is not actually derived from the Greeks. And we thought Aristotle said this. He didn't. Because back then, they didn't have the concept of acts dividing up a play. Aristotle indeed divides the integral parts of a play into 4. See, we have certain misconceptions, and this essay by Dryden is actually addressing those misconceptions so that we get more clarity on what actually was said in Aristotle or Aristotle's Poetics. And let's look at that. First, the protasis or entrance, which gives light only to characters of the persons and proceeds very little into any part of the action. So this is the exposition that Aristotle talks about. Secondly, the epitasis or working up of the plot, that is rising action, where the play grows warmer. The design or action of it is drawing on and you see something promising that it will come to pass. So it is rising action, rising tension. Thirdly, the catastasis is the counter turn. So what we now know as climax is actually the catastasis, which destroys that expectation. So reversal of expectation or the moment of peripeteia, when the action is reversed. Reversal of fortune, reversal of expectation. And then things go downhill for the hero. So finally, we have the part which is catastrophe, which the Grecians called lysis. The French, they called le denouement. And we, the discovery or unraveling of the plot. So lysis, denouement or denouement, however you pronounce it, and discovery or unraveling, resolution, whatever, is all the same thing, and it comes at the 4th part of the play. So why do we talk about 5 acts when we talk about tragedies? This is what his question is. But what poet first limited to 5 the number of acts, I know not. Only we see it so firmly established in the time of Horace that he gives it for a rule in comedy. It was actually Horace who first writes in his book on comedy that there should be 5 acts. But how he came to this conclusion, nobody knows. And then we have examples of plays where this is not followed. But since the Spaniards, that is the Spanish people, at this day allow but 3 acts. Do you know any play which is written in 3 acts? We actually studied them together. The Doll's House and then Look Back in Anger. Many modern plays are written in 3 acts. So at this time, 3-act play, it was not a common thing in England, but the Spanish people, they wrote it. In fact, they followed the 3-act pattern and they call them jornadas. And the Italians, in many of theirs, follow them. When I condemn the ancients, I declare it is not altogether because they have not 5 acts to every play, but because they have not confined themselves to one certain number. Now, with the Italians, what happens? There is no fixed number of acts they follow. It is building a house without a model. And when they succeeded in such undertakings, they ought to have sacrificed to fortune, not to the muses. So there is no fixed pattern established. So it is not a valid starting point. I mean, there is no rule for how many acts should be there. So how can you say that the ancients were setting rules and based on that you are judging the moderns? You can't do that because they were not setting many rules. We think they have set rules, but they haven't. So Eugenius criticizes after this the limited originality and predictability of the ancient Greeks and Roman plots. And he feels that audience could not connect to the plots because, well, they were so predictable. You already know the story of Oedipus and you go and you just see, what's going to happen, that kind of a thing. So there is not much suspense generated. And then Eugenius talks about the defects of the ancients and the points that he raises. If we can summarize them, he first talks about overused plots, comedic cliches, unity of time, place, and action, and lack of consistency in maintaining these. Moral ambiguity, sometimes you don't know whether the hero is morally right or not. And then limited genre crossovers. That means they were very, very strict about sticking to one genre. If you're writing a tragedy, you will write only tragic things. That kind of a mentality. So these are the basic points which Eugenius raises to raise objection against the ancients. And we'll quickly go over how he raises these objections. Next, for the plot, which Aristotle called to mythos and often ton pragmaton synthesis, the ordering of the actions, and from him the Romans called it fabula. It has already been judiciously observed by a late writer that in their tragedies it was only some tale derived from Thebes or Troy, or that means they didn't have much original thing to write on. They didn't create stories. They only wrote and rewrote the same stories which people were much acquainted with. It's like making films after films on Lord Rama or Mahabharata. People already know the stories. And no matter how many perspectives you throw in, how many different ways of looking at the same story you take in, the basic storyline is known to everybody. So the element of suspense is not there. And this is the objection that Eugenius is raising. Same thing is happening in the comedies, and he says the Romans generally borrowed their plots from the Greek poets, and the same predictable pattern was followed. A little girl stolen or wandered from her parents, brought back unknown to the same city, there got with child with some lewd young fellow. So the predictability of the plot automatically creates a sense of detachment in the audience. By the plot, you may guess much of the characters of the persons. So, Eugenius feels that the ancients lacked originality and therefore he prioritizes the moderns compared to the ancients. And then he also says that you are very wrong, Crites. And he says this, in the first place, give me leave to tell you that the unity of place, however it might be practiced by them, was never any of their rules. Maybe it is observed in their plays that their plays are stuck in one place, but it was not a rule for them. We neither find it in Aristotle, Horace, of any who have written of it till in our age, the French poets first made it a precept of the stage. So it is true that all these rules, the rigidity about unity of time, unity of place, all these rigid rules or these rules were rigidly followed by the French playwrights. And they claimed that this was the rule of the ancients. And then he says, it is true, they have kept the continuity, or as you call it, liaison des scenes, somewhat better. What is liaison des scenes? That means, suppose there is the stage in front of you and a character is standing. Now, if that character or say two characters are talking to each other and both of them move out, and then you see two characters enter that stage, but for some moment the stage is empty. That means there's a lack of continuity. What should be the ideal situation is that the two characters will stay on the stage, one of them will move out, and while the second character remains, the third character will come in. So it will be as if that spot gains a continuity. Because in that case, you cannot change the scene. Because that first person is going out, but the second person is remaining there. So if the person is remaining there, the stage scene is not changing. That will bring a kind of a unity of place. But Eugenius says that this was followed in the Greeks because they didn't have many scenes. So they didn't have the problem which Shakespeare had, where he had to move around places. Sometimes he had to go to a heath and bring us the witches, and then he would go to Duncan's palace. He cannot afford to put them all together in the same place. That will be so weird. And Eugenius says, now the plots of their plays being narrow and the persons few, one of their acts was written in a less compass than one of our well-wrought scenes. So their entire act was in a short space, presented in a single space, whereas in case of modern writers, Eugenius feels that we move around a lot because our complexity is more. Our stories are more complex. Our plots are more complex. And the last point, that tragedies and comedies were not written by the same person. But what we see in case of Shakespeare, we get both tragedies and comedies written by the same person. And that's why it is very natural for that same person to blend in these elements of tragedy into comedy and comedy into tragedy. So we have things like tragicomedy, we have things like comic relief, but those things were not available, or those kinds of playwrights were not there during the time of the ancients. So that is their inefficiency according to Eugenius, and not their speciality, not their merit, but that is like something was not available to them. A playwright who could write both was not available to them. So that is a drawback and not something to boast about. So you see how Eugenius takes each and every argument of Critias and goes against it. Now, Critias gets angry. Eugenius constantly hurts his sentiment for the ancients. So what he does, he interrupts Eugenius and he says, I see, Eugenius and I are never like to have this question decided between us, for he maintains the moderns have acquired a new perfection in writing. So, Critias says that Eugenius has decided from the beginning that the moderns have excelled in writing. I can only grant they have altered the mode of it. So, what Critias sees as alteration, change in modern writers is seen as excellence by Eugenius. So the same thing is viewed through different lens. And this is Dryden's speciality. He is giving all points that can be raised and making us think about different points of view instead of just giving his own point of view. And Critias says, Homer described his heroes men of great appetites, lovers of beef broiled upon the coals and good fellows. So back then, ancients, they had these heroic, glorious figures, contrary to the practice of the French romances, whose heroes neither eat, nor drink, nor sleep, nor love. So frail kind of heroes. I wonder what he would have said to Jimmy Porter, the anti-hero. The concept of anti-hero was still not emerging then. But heroes were frail, heroes were human, and they were not the persons of monstrous strength that used to be the heroes in ancient times, right? When you hear stories or plays of ancient times, do we ever hear about a hero who was physically weak? No. Because in order to be a classical hero, you need to have very good physique and strength. And then Critias is trying to tell us that those were the golden times. But then he is open to arguments, and this moderation of Critias, as it was pleasing to all the company, so it put an end to that dispute, which Eugenius, who seemed to have the better of the argument, would urge no further. So in a way we can say that yes, Eugenius was winning the argument and Critias was taking a back foot here. But Lycidius, after he had acknowledged himself of Eugenius's opinion concerning the ancients, yet told him he had forborne till his discourse were ended to ask him why he preferred the English plays above those of other nations. So it was understandable that Eugenius was very much a supporter of the English plays. Now, what Lycidius wanted to know from Eugenius is that why do you have such favor, or why do you favor the English plays so much and not the other category or other language plays? And Eugenius says, though I am at all times ready to defend the honor of my country against the French and to maintain we are as well able to vanquish them with our pens as our ancestors have been with their swords. So Eugenius says that I think we have great potential to be better writers than the French. Just in the same way, we could defend ourselves on the military front. We can defend ourselves against the French, even on the uh, plane of poetry. And we all know that there is a continued rivalry between the French and the English, and Englishmen somehow always try to prove that they are better than the French. But then Eugenius says that I want Neander to talk about this. I will commit this cause to my friend's management. His opinion of our plays is the same with mine. So in a way, we see that Eugenius is giving the responsibility to Neander to defend the English plays. And he kind of says that whatever Neander is saying is whatever I feel as well. So it is more like a democratic setup that we have, where Eugenius doesn't want to talk about it all by himself and he gives the stage to Neander. And then he says that I and Critias, we are talking forever now, and it's better that we should stop and you two should talk. But before Neander can defend the English playwrights, we have Lycidas talking. And what does he say? If the question had been stated who had writ best, the French or English, 40 years ago, I should have been of your opinion. And then he says that Eugenius was saying that the British playwrights can write better than the French. And to this statement, Lycidas is saying that I would have agreed 40 years ago, but at this point, in this situation, I think you are wrong. The British playwrights can't write as well as the French playwrights can. Okay? So he says, we have been so long together, bad Englishmen, that we had not leisure to be good poets. Beaumont, Fletcher, and Johnson, who were only capable of bringing us to that degree of perfection which we have, were just then leaving the world. So the last time British stage was glorious compared to the French was the time before the Reformation. And this is somewhat true, because we know that the Reformation brought in the closing of the theatre, and once the theatre reopened, we have scandalous writings in the name of plays, and a lot of fall was observed so far as style is concerned. The days of Shakespeare and Marlowe were totally gone now, like totally gone. So this is what Lycidas is trying to say, that while the English stage has not recovered yet, the French have become much better, because they didn't have to deal with these kind of civil wars, and they didn't have to deal with these kinds of closing of theaters. So obviously they got better. There was no interruption there. So this is his point. And he says, the muses, whoever follow peace, went to plant in another country. Now that England was going through that horrible civil war, Puritan regime, and the restoration and all that bloodshed, the muse of poetry, the muse of drama, she loves peace, and she goes to a peaceful place called France. And the French poets, the French writers started writing better than the English writers. This is Lycidas's understanding. And then we know that the French playwrights, they were very strict about the three unities. So Lycidas will be talking about that also, and will be saying why this strictness was important for the French writers. In the unity of time, you find them so scrupulous, so meticulous, so detailed, that it yet remains a dispute among their poets whether the artificial day of 12 hours more or less be not meant by Aristotle rather than the natural one of 24. So the point of difference that one French playwright has from another is whether the storyline should be of 24 hours or 12 hours. So that is the dispute they have. That means in any case that is too rigid. 24 hours, 12 hours. Think about Macbeth. It is ages. So French poets are very meticulous, playwrights are very meticulous about the unity of time. In the unity of place, they are full as scrupulous. For many of their critics limit it to that very spot of ground where the play is supposed to begin. None of them exceed the compass of the same town or city. So some playwrights stick to one place as one setting and stay there throughout the whole play. At the most, they take the scene to some other spot, but within the same town. It's not like you're going to Scotland and then you're coming back to England. Not like that. You stay within the same town. So it's very rigid. And this rigidity is praised by Lycidas. And he says that, look, how rigid they are, how scrupulous they are, how meticulous they are. The unity of action in all their plays is yet more conspicuous. For they do not burden them with underplots like subplots, which is a very, very crucial feature in English plays, especially comedies, Shakespearean comedies to be more specific. But in case of French plays, there is no concept of any subplot. Okay? There is no theatre in the world has anything so absurd as the English tragicomedy. And this is where Lycidas is saying the problem lies for English playwrights, that they mix up tragedy and comedy. They mix up episodes of comic relief within tragic expanse. And he says that it is an absurd thing that the British people are doing. They are creating tragicomedy. It is a drama of our own invention, and the fashion of it is enough to proclaim it so. Here, a course of mirth. So somebody is laughing, and then there another of sadness and passion. Suddenly everybody is angry and sad and full of passion. There is a third scene where you talk about honor, and fourth, you see a duel. So everything is hodgepodge, mixed up. Thus, in 2 hours and a half, we run through all the fits of Bedlam. Bedlam is, you can say, it's a madhouse. It's a people who have some kind of mental condition. They are all put together. It's like an asylum. So, and they have these fits, which are obviously very, very rowdy. And somehow this description of English tragicomedy by Lycidas, it brings to my mind the usual movies of Bollywood. Okay, where you have item song, and then you have a tragic death of the hero's mother or daughter or wife. And then in the same movie, you have comic relief, and then you have a grand wedding, and you have lovely songs in the mountains, whatnot. So it's all a mix. It's as if all kinds of emotions are offered to you, and that is problematic in the eyes of Lycidas. Our poets present you the play and the farce together. So that is his objection. He must ruin the sole end and object of his tragedy to introduce somewhat that is forced in and is not of the body of it. Would you not think that physician mad, who having prescribed a purge, should immediately order you to take restringent upon it? So purgative means something which you take in order to, wash away your system. Okay, so it's to purge yourself of or your intestines of all the bad things that you must have eaten. And then restringent means a medicine which, stops you from flowing yourself out. So it's like opposing things. So will a doctor ever prescribe such opposing medicines? On one hand, a purgative, and on the other hand, an antibiotic to stop your system from flushing yourself out? No. And that is what Lycidas is saying. How can a play expect you to weep and laugh at the same time? That's what tragicomedy does. And therefore, he considers tragicomedy as a low level of play. And therefore, it is like a blemish in the history of drama. He further says that there is a tendency in British playwrights to burden themselves too much with plot. And he says, I return again to French writers who, as I have said, do not burden themselves too much with plot, which has been reproached to them by an ingenious person of our nation as a fault, for he says they commonly make but one person considerable in a play. They dwell upon him, his concernments, while the rest of the persons are only subservient to set him off. Now, what happens if you have a kind of a pyramidal plot? When you have the concept of tragedy, uh, we usually have this concept of one single hero whose fortune we are interested in. So, we are not actually focusing on other characters. But with the French writers, this thing doesn't happen. So they don't neglect all the characters. They give them proper dialogue and everything. And then he moves on to say that when you have a dilution of tragedy, then what happens? That suppose there's a very tragic scene, the audience will start laughing because you've already messed up with their reactions. They don't know what to actually expect out of your play, whether to laugh, whether to weep, and they get mixed emotions. And that he says here, I have observed that in all our tragedies, the audience cannot forbear laughing when the actors are to die. It is the most comic part of the whole play. All passions may be lively represented on the stage. Now he says that it is a very wrong thing to show somebody dying on the stage because the audience knows the person is not dead. So no matter how well you act, you can never act death because the audience knows that you are a living person. So there is a clash of knowledge, the knowledge about the story and the knowledge about the reality that clashes. And so the audience will never be able to feel the thing that you want them to feel. And what should be done instead? Instead, the news of somebody's death, accident, whatever bad things, violence, that should be narrated and not shown on stage because if you see two people fighting with a sword, you know the swords are fake, you will laugh, you will not weep, you will not feel scared. This is Lycidas' argument. And he says that instead of that, if a good narration is used, that is good, and that is what the French people do. And finally, he says that, see, there are many more good things about French plays, but I will just finish with this last one, that you will never see any of their plays end with a conversion or simply change of will, that there is a throughout, you see a bad person suddenly becomes good. So that kind of a divine intervention, unexplained illogical changes, that is not seen in case of French plays, which is very, very common in case of English plays. So this is how Lycidas is speaking in favor of the French playwrights. And who comes finally to defend his country's playwrights? None other than Neander, who is basically the spokesperson of Dryden himself. And obviously, if it is Dryden's essay, he is going to present his point at the end to have the greatest impact. And Neander takes up each point that he has got till now and will be refuting them one by one. So let's quickly go over how he does that. First thing that Neander does is that he acknowledges the greatness of the French writers. It's not that he is refuting any of the things on the face. He knows that the best way to win an argument is to show a kind of an acceptance of certain points of your opponent. And he does that. He says, yes, the French are very regular and everything. And he says, for I acknowledge the French contrive their plots more regularly, observe the laws of comedy and decorum of the stage with more exactness than the English. He also says, I deny not, but he has taxed us justly in some irregularities of ours. Yes, we are irregular. We are not as strict as the French. And then he says, but strictness is not the definition of drama. Imitation is. And this is where he takes the point of Lycidas and throws it at him. How? For the lively imitation of nature being in the definition of a play, those which best fulfill that law, that imitation of nature, ought to be esteemed superior. Now, he's saying that beauties of the French poesy are such as will raise perfection higher. French people write such beautiful poetry. Like, you look at a statue, how exquisitely beautiful it is. But is it alive? No, because that statue is not the perfect imitation. It is always lifeless. So see how he's taking the point of Lycidas and bending it to suit his own purpose. He's saying, yes, the French are superior versifiers. The French are very great painters of words. But that doesn't make them look like real life. And he says, in fact, of late years, that is, whatever Lycidas had been saying was true so far as French playwrights were concerned during the time of Corneille. But what about the present times? Now he is giving us some trivia or knowledge about what was happening during that time. At that time, he was observing that the French playwrights were actually imitating the English stage. They were bringing in elements of comedy within tragedy and tragedy within comedy to create that blended effect. And he says, they have mixed their serious plays with mirth, like our tragicomedies since the death of Cardinal Richelieu. I hope I'm pronouncing him correctly. Most of their new plays are like some of ours, derived from the Spanish novels. So, yes, they are following our footsteps. So, how can we say that they are superior to us? Because they are following us now. And how does Neander defend the idea of tragicomedy or mixing up of comedy and tragedy? He says, a continued gravity keeps the spirit too much bent. If you constantly look at a serious thing, you get kind of covered down with sadness. We must refresh it sometimes as we bait upon a journey that we may go on with greater ease. A scene of mirth mixed with tragedy has the same effect upon us which our music has between the acts. And that we find a relief to us from the best plots and language of the stage if the discourses have been long. Now, if there is a long set of dialogue going on or somebody's monologue is going on forever or a long soliloquy, after that some kind of relief will be good. And then he compares the plots of the French plays with the plots of English, and he says their plots are single. Yes, they don't have subplots. They carry on one design which is pushed forward by all the actors, every scene in the play contributing and moving towards it. Ours, that is English plays, besides the main design, have underplots of less considerable persons and intrigues which are carried on with the motion of the main plot. The idea of subplot is not to take you away from the main plot, but to provide a parallel plot, which kind of reinforces the idea which is given in the main plot. So that the main plot is about revenge. The subplot will be also about revenge in some way. So it will be actually helping in building up the idea of the main plot. So it will not go against it, but rather for it. So this is Neander's argument. And then he also says that the poetry in French plays, they sound very cold because again, they try to be so perfect in their versification that they lack human element. And he says, I confess their verses are to me the coldest I have ever read. And then he says, their speeches being so many declamations which tire us with length. Such long speeches are there in French plays, so that instead of persuading us to grieve for their imaginary heroes, so instead of weeping for the hero, we rather get so irritated because that hero before his death gives a 3-page long speech. So we don't actually feel sorry that he's dead. We begin to feel that he should have died earlier. We are in the tedious visits of bad company. We are in pain till they are gone. And actors, and he's saying, the actors speak by the hourglass as our parsons do. It's like, you go to this church and the parson, the priest, he gives a sermon and it goes on for hours. Like this class is going on for hours. So imagine a person on the verge of death speaking like I am speaking in this video for 2 hours. That is not natural, and that creates a kind of artificiality in the mind of the audience. And then the actors, they feel very bad if they are not given such long speeches. They feel offended. Okay. they account it the grace of their parts and think themselves disparaged by the poet if they may not twice or thrice in the play entertain the audience with a speech of 100 or 200 lines. So that is their setup, mental setup, that I need to give this long speech in order to be established as a good actor. Now, this is where the British playwrights are going against, or rather going contrary to the way the French plays are written. The final thing that he refutes is that suppose there is a scene on stage where Lycidas was saying that somebody is dying, somebody is fighting with a sword. How can you believe it? You know it's fake. Neander says that if I can believe that the two people fighting on stage are two characters, I know that they are acting, but I still believe that they are characters. Maybe they are brothers or maybe they are enemies, whatever it is. I believe in that. So if I believe in that, I can also believe or make myself believe temporarily that the sword is real. But he says that yes, death should not be shown on stage because somehow that is disturbing. But a little fight is fine. A little action is fine. And British theatre goers, they were not of one kind of people, they were a mixed variety of people. So some people responded to action, some people responded to comedy. That is why this kind of fusion, this kind of evolution happened in English stage because of the nature of the theatre goers. So with this, we get to understand the different points of view that are placed by these people, and they also go through a detailed study of a particular play, The Silent Woman. I'm not going through those details because whatever their point is, they are establishing their points through this drama. And this play was written by Ben Jonson. And Neander, by going through this, he concludes with the reflection on the superiority of English comedic talent. And he says that Jonson's work stands favorably against both contemporary and historical counterparts. So Neander is very firm in establishing that no, the British stage has not deteriorated. We actually have become better than our ancients. We do have counter arguments, again rising out of their arguments. And if we are to look at the most important counter argument that comes out, is given by Crites. He says that Neander should talk about the usage of rhyme in poetry. Now, it has to be understood that rhyme was not used by the ancient Greeks. All right? Meter was a part of their writing, but rhyme was not. So how does this whole concept of blank verse come in? So this is what Crites wants Neander to talk about. And what does Neander say? It concerns me less than any, says Neander, to reply to this discourse, because when I should have proved that verse may be natural in plays, yet I should always be ready to confess that those which I have written in this kind come short of that perfection which is required. That verse is not the requirement of a play. And then he says, I exclude all comedy from my defense. And next that I deny not, but blank verse may also be used, and content myself only to assert that in serious plays, where the subject and characters are great and the plot unmixed with mirth, that is, if a tragedy is a true tragedy, there is no mixture of comedy, then rhyme is natural and more effectual than blank verse. But if there is any kind of a mixture and whatever, then you are being close to reality, and in reality we don't speak in rhymes. So why should there be rhyme in a play? It is better if written in blank verse. And after they have some conversation on whether even blank verse is natural or not, because blank verse is also like you are restricting yourself. And to that, Neander says that it's important to restrict yourself, because if you don't have some kind of metrical restriction, then it is a possibility that you will go overboard with your emotions. So if you have to think about restricting yourself to, iambic pentameter lines, you don't have to think about rhyme, but at least the meter, then your emotions will automatically be properly or appropriately moderated, and you will not go overboard with your words and emotions in the dialogue or the monologues. And finally, when they go on speaking on these different kinds of approaches to drama, they realize that the noise of guns, which were coming because of that naval battle, that had stopped, and they realize it's time to go home, and they go their different ways. And although this argument ends abruptly, we do understand that Neander is fighting in favor of the British playwrights. And if we are to give a very condensed summary of their main points of argument, then it should sound like this: that Crites, spokesman for the ancients, and what are his main contentions? First of all, he says dramatic art reached maturity in ancient Greece, and they emulated nature, observed the unities, and they had superiority of expression. This was Crites' main points. Eugenius is more like a spokesman of the moderns, although he doesn't distinguish between different kinds of modern writers, but he generally says that there were flaws in ancient plays, like ineffective structural divisions, reliance on hackneyed plots, and he says that the idea of unities, it should be challenged because it leads to absurdity, and these were not originally Aristotelian also. The other thing that Eugenius says is that he critiques the ancients for their themes, which often glorified vice instead of promoting moral virtues. So this is Eugenius's idea. Lycidius clearly was an advocate of the French playwrights, and he praises the French drama and says that their observation of the three unities proves their mastery. And he talks about the familiar history that we see in the plots of the French writings. And at the same time, he praises the characterization and narrative skills, along with a criticism of the English dramatists, that English playwrights, they use excessive action, they lack decorum, and the French are very restrained, and they are supposed to be good compared to the British. But Neander is the spokesperson of England, and he's also he's a spokesperson of liberty, and he defends the English drama. And he says that integration of genres, mixing tragedy and comedy, is not a vice but a virtue. It's a positive evolution. And he says that it allows for emotional contrast and authenticity. That reality is like that, a combination of these emotions. So why are we expecting plays, which is supposed to be imitation of nature, to present only one kind of emotion? Because life is like a combination of emotions. So an authentic play should give off both tragic and comic feelings. Then he criticizes the French rigor and the rigid separation of tragic and comic elements. And then he talks about the value of subplots, which is connected to this idea. And also he appreciates English playwrights like, of course, Shakespeare, Beaumont, Fletcher, Johnson. And then he says how they are very strong in their presentation of reality. So this essay, which was written during the Restoration period, of course, this was a time when English drama was going through a lot of transformation. And people were bothered about the function of drama. So this essay was very, very relevant at the times, and it still is relevant because it addresses the question of the utility of literature, or whether literature should be valued in terms of utility or not. Because again, then towards the end of the Victorian times, we have this art for art's sake movement. Aestheticism, which says, maybe someday I'll talk on it, that art has its value because it is art, not because it teaches you something, or doesn't have to be a tool of moral lesson class. So that's a different way of looking at it. But during the Restoration, which came immediately after the Puritan regime, the value of literature, whether it should be judged according to the utility it provides. And again, this was also the time which led eventually to the idea of utilitarianism. So many things are connected here, but what we see is that Neander is not establishing any kind of aestheticism here. He is rather proposing a utilitarian theory, and a theory that art doesn't have to be perfect in an artistic way. Rather, it should be accessible to humans. And because drama is a very, very public genre, it's not for just for a few elite readers, but for common people as well. Therefore, it should link directly to the emotions felt by the common man. So this is Neander, who speaks or takes the stand of a common man. And there's a kind of a reassessment of dramatic standards and a kind of a tension between tradition and modernity. And this tension continues. It continues through Arnold, it continues through Eliot, and it goes on forever. So what we have is that there are merits to both ancient and modern drama. The English tradition is very original. It has emotional depth, capacity for variety, and it is like an evolved genre. It didn't stick to the rules and regulations rigidly. And that is the nature of British theatre goers, because drama changes because of the people that go to the theatre to watch it. So you don't see this essay just as a comment or an analysis or a critical note on drama or plays, but rather a kind of a commentary on nature of art and its relationship to society. And it's a critical moment in literary history. And this work helps us to understand about some of the misconceptions we have regarding Aristotle. And if you study this work together with Sir Philip Sidney's Defense of Poetry or Apology for Poetry, you will have a more rounded understanding of how the literary criticism starts in England with, Sidney, Spencer, and then you have Johnson and eventually Wordsworth, Shelley, Keats, Coleridge writing on literature. But these are the starting points, Dryden and Sidney. We have completed Dryden today. Maybe someday we'll take up Sidney's Apology for Poetry. If you want me to cover that, you can write that in the comment section. And you can also comment if you found this video useful. So till we meet again very soon with a new video, this is Monami Mukherjee signing off. Bye-bye. Thank you.